I still remember the sharp clinking of glasses that night. The laughter that wasn't meant for me, the way every eye at the long dining table turned my way, waiting for my embarrassment. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, just another evening at my mother-in-law's grand estate. But it became the moment that burned itself into my memory, the night that planted the seed of my revenge. Her voice cut through the room like a knife. "You can't cook," she declared, her words loud enough to echo against the marble walls. She didn't whisper it. She didn't try to hide it behind politeness. She wanted the world, or at least the 20 guests gathered there, to hear her verdict of me. I felt the sting immediately. My cheeks burned, but not from shame, no, from anger. That was her game, though. Humiliation, public degradation. Subtle reminders that I was never good enough for her son, never good enough for her family, and certainly not good enough to sit at her table. I forced a smile, though my hands trembled under the tablecloth. My husband, sitting beside me, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Of course, he wouldn't. He never did when it came to his mother. I lowered my gaze, tracing the pattern of the expensive plate set in front of us. Inside, my mind screamed 1,000 responses I could never say aloud. Because in this family, silence was survival, but silence doesn't last forever. It's strange, isn't it? How insults sound louder when they're spoken by someone you're supposed to call family. Her words followed me home that night, haunting me in the quiet of our bedroom. My husband tried to reassure me in his usual dismissive way. "She didn't mean it," he said. "You know how my mother is." But I did know how his mother was. She was cruel, calculated. She thrived on control. And her restaurant was proof of that. Yes. My mother-in-law wasn't just a woman with opinions, she was the proud owner of one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. A landmark establishment, where reservations had to be booked months in advance, where food critics wrote glowing reviews, where power brokers and politicians dined under golden chandeliers. She called it her kingdom, and in many ways it was, and in her eyes, I was nothing more than an intruder. The truth is, I never claimed to be a professional chef. I didn't grow up in a gourmet kitchen. But I did know how to cook quiet, humble meals that carried the warmth of home. My grandmother's recipes. My mother's little tricks. Dishes that might not have looked extravagant, but had flavor that could silence a room. But to my mother-in-law, that didn't matter. To her, cooking wasn't about love or creativity or even skill. It was about status, presentation, control. She didn't just own a restaurant. She owned the narrative of who was worthy in her family and who wasn't, and in her story. I was cast as the failure. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while my husband drifted into his usual heavy sleep. Every replay of her words sparked a fire inside me. "You can't cook." It was funny, almost ironic. Because deep inside, I knew cooking was the one thing that made me feel like myself. In the kitchen, away from judgment, away from her sharp eyes, I felt alive, and maybe that was the very reason she wanted to take it away from me. The next morning, I walked into our small kitchen quietly, while the house was still asleep. I tied my hair back, rolled up my sleeves, and pulled out ingredients not for anyone else, but for me. The scent of garlic sizzling in olive oil filled the air. I chopped herbs finely, just the way my grandmother had taught me. I remembered her voice as she leaned over my shoulder years ago, whispering, "Cooking isn't about showing off. It's about love. If you cook with love, people will always taste it." And for the first time since marrying into this family, I cooked not to prove anything, but simply to remind myself who I was. When the dish was done, I sat alone at the table and took the first bite. The flavors exploded, familiar, comforting, real, and that's when the idea crept into my mind. Soft at first, like a whisper. But as the days passed, it grew louder, stronger. If she thought I couldn't cook, if she thought I would stay silent forever, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The following weeks were a strange balance of masks and secrets. At family gatherings, I kept my head down, letting her jabs roll off me like water off stone. She laughed, her friends laughed, my husband chuckled awkwardly, but I didn't break. I stored every insult like a weapon, sharpening it for later. Behind closed doors, though, I worked. Every night after my husband slept, I cooked. I tested recipes, refined flavors, experimented with new techniques. I watched culinary tutorials, read books, scribbled notes. My tiny kitchen became my training ground, my war room. Sometimes I burned dishes. Sometimes the flavors clashed. But failure only fueled me more. Because unlike her, I wasn't born with a silver spoon or a restaurant empire handed to me. I was building something from scratch, and in my bones, I knew the food I created carried something hers never could hurt. But here's the thing about revenge. It doesn't arrive overnight. It's a slow simmer, a recipe you can't rush. And I knew if I was going to take back my dignity, if I was going to strike where it hurt the most, I had to be patient. I started small, hosting dinners for a few close friends, serving them my dishes quietly, without fanfare. And every single time, their reactions fed my confidence. They weren't just eating food, they were devouring it. They begged for seconds, asked for recipes, showered me with compliments. One night, one of them said something that changed everything. "You know, your food. It's better than that restaurant your mother-in-law owns." The table erupted in laughter, but my heart froze. Better than her restaurant. The thought had never dared cross my mind before. But now, it wouldn't leave me, and that was when I made a promise to myself. If she wanted to humiliate me for not being a cook, then I would rise, not as her daughter-in-law, not as the silent woman in the corner, but as the one who would take over her empire, piece by piece, dish by dish, until her words no longer defined me, because my success would. That was the beginning. The first spark. The night she mocked me, she thought she was cutting me down. She thought she was winning, but little did she know. She had just handed me the fuel I needed to set fire to her entire kingdom. It's strange how silence becomes a shield when you're living under someone else's shadow. For weeks, I played the role my mother-in-law expected of me, the quiet, obedient wife, smiling politely while she boasted about her restaurant, her influence, her reputation. At tea family gatherings, I let her insults pass. At dinners, I let her friends laugh when she mocked me for serving store-bought desserts or ordering takeout. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that every smirk, every dig, every smug tilt of her head was pushing me further into my kitchen at night, my secret place, my rebellion, my sanctuary. By day, I was her meek daughter-in-law. By night, I became something else entirely. The chopping board echoed with determination. Knives became an extension of my hands. Pots clanged like war drums. The aroma of spices filled the air: garlic, cumin, saffron, basil, each scent weaving itself into the threads of my growing confidence. I wasn't just cooking anymore. I was learning, crafting, building. I studied menus from her restaurant, comparing them with culinary books I borrowed. I recreated her so-called signature dishes, tasting them side by side with my own. And do you know what I realized? Her food lacked soul. It looked beautiful, yes, polished plates with perfect garnish, shimmering under the light of crystal chandeliers. But when I closed my eyes and tasted them, there was nothing. Just cold perfection, meant to impress, not to comfort. Meanwhile, my food carried warmth, memories, a story in every bite. One evening, while testing a stew recipe, I caught myself whispering aloud, "She has a restaurant, but I have flavor. And one day, that will be enough." The cracks in her empire began to show not long after. It started subtly. A whispered comment from one of her friends at dinner: "Reservations aren't as hard to get these days, are they?" Another night, I overheard a conversation between my husband and his cousin. "Critics say the menu feels outdated, too old-fashioned." And then, the real blow: a newspaper article, hidden in the business section, mentioning a dip in the restaurant's revenue. Nothing catastrophic, not yet, but enough to tell me what I needed to know. The Queen was faltering. Still, she carried herself with arrogance. At every gathering, she boasted of her flawless reputation. She laughed at the idea of competition. She rolled her eyes at the suggestion of change. And every time she laughed, I smiled to myself, because I knew something she didn't. Arrogance blinds even the strongest. I tested this theory one Sunday afternoon. She had invited us, as always, to her grand dining hall. The staff bustled about with silver trays, serving courses that looked like art but tasted like emptiness. I ate quietly, but my mind buzzed with ideas. Then she turned to me, her voice sharp and loud enough for the room to hear. "Tell me, dear, do you even know what truffle oil is? Or do you only cook with salt and pepper?" The table chuckled. My husband stared at his plate, and I met her eyes for the first time without flinching, and said softly, "I know enough to tell when food has no heart in it." The laughter died instantly. A hush fell over the table. Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, I saw the flicker of doubt. She recovered quickly, of course, plastering on her practiced smile. But that look, I carried it home like a trophy. That night, I wrote in my notebook, the one I had started keeping for my recipes and plans: "She's losing her grip. The restaurant is slipping. And when it falls, I'll be there to catch it." The universe has a strange way of rewarding persistence. Within weeks, my small dinner experiments at home started gaining attention. Word spread among friends that my food was something special. A neighbor asked me to cater a small gathering. Just 10 people. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. That night, I served them dishes I had perfected in secret: rosemary chicken with lemon glaze, mushroom risotto infused with truffle, and my grandmother's spice lentil soup. The reaction was overwhelming. They praised every bite, licking spoons clean, begging me to cook again. One woman even pulled me aside and whispered, "Honestly, your food is better than your mother-in-law's restaurant. You should think bigger." Her words stuck to me like honey. Think bigger. But with growth came danger. I had to be careful. My husband noticed the late nights in the kitchen, the endless groceries, the notebooks filled with scribbles. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked one night, half curious, half annoyed. I smiled faintly. "Because one day, I want more than just silence." He didn't press further. He never did. But the unease in his eyes told me he sensed something coming. And something was coming, because soon, whispers about my cooking reached ears I hadn't expected. A family friend who happened to know one of the city's food bloggers mentioned me. Within days, I received a message on social media: "I've heard about your cooking. Would you be open to hosting a private tasting?" I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding. This wasn't just friends or neighbors anymore. This was an opportunity. A door cracking open, and I knew. If I stepped through, there was no turning back. The night before the tasting, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by ingredients, recipes spread across the counter like battle plans. My hands trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. I thought of her again. My mother-in-law. The woman who told me I couldn't cook. The woman who laughed at me in front of everyone. And I whispered to myself, like a vow, "You tried to bury me with your words. But you forgot. I'm a seed." When the tasting night arrived, I poured my soul into every dish. By the end of the evening, the blogger sat back, eyes wide, declaring, "This is the kind of food people will line up for." My chest tightened with pride, but also with something darker. Because I wasn't just doing this for recognition. I was doing it to take her down that night. As I lay in bed beside my oblivious husband, I finally admitted the truth to myself. This wasn't just about proving I could cook. This was about building something so powerful, so undeniable, that when the time came, I could walk into her kingdom, her restaurant, and take it from her hands. Not with screaming, not with insults, but with food, with proof, with power. Every empire begins with a story. Mine began in my grandmother's kitchen. When I was a child, her kitchen wasn't a place of perfection or polished silver. It was small, worn, filled with the smells of simmering stews and baked bread cooling on the counter. She didn't own golden chandeliers or imported truffle oils. She owned a cast iron pot, wooden spoons, and an instinct for flavor that no textbook could ever teach. She used to tell me, "Cooking is memory. You serve not just food, but moments. And people will never forget how you made them feel at the table." Back then, I didn't understand the weight of her words. But standing in my own kitchen now, years later, I felt them echo in my bones, and I realized something important. My revenge wouldn't just be built on dishes, it would be built on stories, on heritage, on authenticity. One rainy afternoon, I dug out an old wooden box from the back of my closet. Inside, folded neatly, were scraps of paper, yellowed with time. My grandmother's recipes. Handwritten notes in her careful cursive. Smudged with flour fingerprints and oil stains, my heart ached as I unfolded them. Reading words I hadn't seen in years. Cinnamon for warmth. Always roast the garlic first, it changes everything. Never rush a stew. Patience feeds the soul. I ran my fingers over the pages, and for the first time in a long while I cried. Not from sadness. From resolve. Because here was my weapon. Not her cold, soulless perfection, but the heart of a family line she had dismissed as unworthy. The next weeks became a blur of experiments. I cooked every recipe from that box, adding my own twists, adjusting flavors, modernizing presentations without stripping their soul. Neighbors who had tasted my food before now returned, bringing friends, asking for more. My small kitchen became a revolving door of laughter, clinking spoons and satisfied sighs, and word kept spreading. Soon, a local boutique owner asked if I'd cater her launch event. Then a small gallery requested canapés for their opening. Every gig felt like a test, and with each one, I passed. My food wasn't just feeding people. It was creating whispers, the kind that travel far and fast in a city hungry for something new. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law's restaurant began to show more obvious cracks. A food blogger different from the one I hosted published a piece criticizing the restaurant's outdated menu. Another review commented on the lack of innovation. And the once full dining room, empty tables started appearing, even on weekends. She brushed it off, of course. At Sunday dinners, she waved away the news with her manicured hand, saying things like, "Critics are fickle. My reputation will never fade," but beneath her bravado, I could see it, the tiny flicker of unease in her eyes, and I savored it. One evening, while perfecting my grandmother's spiced lamb dish, I asked myself a dangerous question. What if I could take her restaurant? Not just outshine it, not just compete with it, but truly, undeniably, take it? The thought was bold, almost reckless, but it clung to me like perfume I couldn't wash away. Because what better revenge than stripping her of the very thing she worshipped? Around this time, my husband began noticing more. The constant groceries, the catered events, the late nights filled with the sound of sizzling pans and clattering pots. One night, he leaned against the doorway, watching me stir a pot of soup. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked, his tone more tired than curious. I paused, ladle in hand, before answering softly, "Because I want something that's mine." He frowned but didn't press further. That was his way, silent complicity. Perhaps part cowardice, part survival, but deep down, I wondered, when the time came, whose side would he stand on? The turning point came unexpectedly. At one of the gallery events I catered, a man in a tailored suit approached me. He introduced himself as a silent investor in several local restaurants. After sampling my food, he smiled in a way that felt both calculating and impressed. "You have something special," he said. "Have you ever considered opening your own place?" My pulse quickened. For a moment, I imagined saying yes. Imagine signing a lease, hanging a sign with my name, creating a space filled with warmth, laughter, and food that mattered. But then I thought of her, my mother-in-law. The way she laughed at me, the way she declared I couldn't cook, the way she lauded her restaurant over the family like a crown, and I realized it wasn't enough to open my own. Not yet. No, I wanted hers. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at my grandmother's recipes spread out before me. The rain tapped against the window like a metronome, steady and unrelenting. I whispered aloud, as if speaking to my grandmother herself, "I will honor you. I will honor every meal you taught me." And I will make her choke on her own arrogance. For the first time, I no longer felt like the humiliated woman at the dining table. I felt like a woman standing at the edge of something bigger, and I knew the time for silence was ending. But revenge, I reminded myself, is like cooking a slow stew. It takes patience, it takes heat, and it takes knowing exactly when to serve it. And I was just getting started. I used to think arrogance was invincible, that people who carried themselves like royalty were untouchable, that nothing could topple them. But watching my mother-in-law's empire falter, I realized arrogance is the easiest crown to steal because those who wear it never believe it can fall. The first sign was subtle. A half-empty dining room on a Friday night. I'd gone with my husband, as always, to another one of her self-congratulatory family dinners. Normally, the restaurant buzzed with chatter, every table occupied, waiters rushing back and forth with plates balanced like works of art. But that night, I noticed empty tables. Not many, but enough to make me smile behind my wine glass. She, of course, pretended not to see. "Oh, a few cancellations," she said when her friend asked about it. "Everyone is traveling these days." But I knew better. I saw the shift in the waiter's eyes, the strain in the manager's smile. Then came the second sign, a review in the city's most respected food magazine. Not a scathing one, she was too established for that, but one laced with carefully worded doubt. While the presentation remains impeccable, one cannot help but feel the menu clings too tightly to the past. The city's culinary scene is evolving. Has this iconic restaurant evolved with it? I read those lines over and over, my lips curling upward each time. Because the truth was, it hadn't evolved, and she never would let it. By the third sign, even her loyal customers started whispering. At a family dinner, one of her longtime friends leaned closer and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "You know, I went to that new fusion place downtown. The flavors. It was refreshing. So different from what we used to hear." I pretended not to listen, but inside, I devoured it like honey, because while her kingdom was growing stale, mine was quietly blossoming in secret. A tea night. My kitchen transformed into a laboratory of flavors. I experimented with blending my grandmother's recipes with modern twists, traditional stews plated with elegance, rustic breads paired with inventive spreads, desserts that combined heritage with innovation. The more I cooked, the more I realized I wasn't just learning, I was surpassing. Her food may have been polished, but mine was alive. Still, I knew revenge couldn't come from the shadows. If I wanted her empire, I had to step into the light, and fate, it seemed, was already setting the stage. One evening, while my husband scrolled absently through his phone, I overheard him mumbling about the restaurant's finances. "Staff cuts," he said under his breath. "Mother doesn't want anyone to know, but..." He trailed off. My heart quickened. Staff cuts meant financial strain, and financial strain meant opportunity. I leaned casually against the doorframe, pretending disinterest, but my ears caught every word. "Nothing serious," he added quickly when he saw me watching. "She just needs to tighten things for a while." I nodded, hiding my smile, because I knew something he didn't. Restaurants don't tighten unless something is truly wrong. That night, as he slept, I lay awake in the dark, whispering to myself, "This is it. The cracks are spreading, and soon the whole structure will collapse." But I wasn't naive. I knew I couldn't just walk in and snatch her crown. No, I needed a plan, and so I began to craft one. Step 1. Build credibility. Not just among friends or neighbors, but in circles that mattered. I needed critics, investors, influencers to know my food before my name ever appeared publicly. Step 2. Position myself quietly within reach of her restaurant. Not as an enemy, at least, not yet, but as someone who could help. Step 3. Wait patiently until the perfect moment arrived. I started with step 1. The food blogger who had praised my dishes introduced me to a small circle of critics who often scouted for new culinary talent. They were skeptical at first. Who was I but a housewife cooking out of her kitchen? But once they tasted my food, the skepticism vanished. Their praise was quiet, but it spread like embers before a fire. Soon, I was hosting underground tasting nights, intimate gatherings of food lovers who craved authenticity. Word spread among the city's inner circles. There was something new, something different, hidden in plain sight, and all the while, my mother-in-law remained oblivious. The opportunity for step 2 came faster than I expected. One afternoon, while sipping tea at her house, she complained loudly to her friends about lazy staff and customers who didn't understand fine dining anymore, and then, with a dramatic sigh, she said, "Sometimes I wish I had fresh ideas. But people don't appreciate tradition anymore." Her words hung in the air like bait, and I almost laughed, because here she was, unknowingly voicing the very weakness I was about to exploit. That night, I drafted a plan more specific than ever. If her restaurant was crumbling, I wouldn't just compete. I would infiltrate. I would offer myself as the solution, the one with fresh ideas. She wouldn't see me as a threat because in her mind, I could never be one, and by the time she realized what I was doing, it would be too late. I remember standing at my kitchen counter, notebook in hand, recipes spread across the table. My hand shook, but not from fear, from anticipation, because I wasn't just cooking anymore. I was plotting. Every dish was a step closer to her throne. Every recipe was another brick in the empire I would build not beside hers. But on top of it, the queen was faltering, and I was readying myself to take her crown. A plan is a fragile thing if kept in a single mind. It needs people, resources, loopholes, and most importantly, plausible deniability. I couldn't storm the castle alone. I needed allies who could move in places I could not. The banker who understood ledgers. The ex-chef who still knew the back of house secrets. The quiet friend who loved spreadsheets as much as she loved great food. I didn't recruit them with dramatic speeches. I recruited them with dinner invitations. There's a kind of intimacy that happens around a table, candles, low lights, the clink of cutlery, the hush as someone tastes a dish and shuts their eyes. I used that intimacy as my boardroom. I fed them food that made them remember their best meals. Then I told them a bit of my story. Not the whole revenge manifesto, just enough to make them care. First was Lila. We'd been neighbors for years, the sort of friend who knows your laundry schedule and the story of your childhood dog. She ran a small marketing consultancy and had a soft spot for anything that smelled like authenticity. Over coffee, my coffee. I insisted on hosting. We talked about everything from branding to the cruelty of gatekeepers in our city's culinary scene. You could do something with this, she said, tapping a finger against a napkin where I'd scribbled menu ideas. I want to, I answered. But I didn't say whose empire I wanted to take. She didn't need all the details to understand the shape of my hunger. Next was Omar. He'd once been a sous chef at my mother-in-law's restaurant and left quietly after a spat with the head chef over a plate used purely for show. He knew the kitchen like the back of his hand, how orders got prioritized, which vendors gave better produce but lower invoices, which waiters would cover for mistakes and which would quietly resent the management. He met me after hours in a dim coffee shop, and over a plate of samosas I'd made, he told me he'd never felt proud of the food he'd served there. That pridelessness is lethal in a kitchen. You don't live a place like that unless you're ready to bury it, he said, half joke, half promise. His eyes shone with a fierce kind of loyalty, one not to a family, but to the craft of cooking itself. Finally, there was Amir, my husband's cousin, who handled finances at a boutique investment firm. He didn't like family drama and avoided it, but he had an accountant's curiosity about anything that smelled like opportunity. I invited him for a quiet meal and, between bites, sketched a scenario: revenue slippage, declining reservations, an owner resistant to change. When I finished, he steepled his fingers. You could position yourself as consultant first, he said. Offer short-term fixes. Patch the leaks. Then, when cash flow is thin and the owner tired, there's room for an investor. We'd want to structure it so your involvement is detached at first, advice, not ownership. Later, convert it. It was exactly the sort of chess move I needed. An approach that seemed caring, helpful, respectable, one that the queen would accept without fearing the dagger beneath the velvet sleeve. We moved slowly, like cooks testing a new reduction. Lila worked on subtle branding, an idea of heritage meets modernity that didn't scream revolution but whispered it. Omar began testing staff morale and kitchen processes when he could, offering anonymous feedback about supplier inefficiencies that made the managers tighten their wallets in ways that created apparent savings but actually nudged the system into fragility. Amir scoped debt options and friendly investors who liked the idea of buying into a turnaround. He also quietly checked the legal agreements my mother-in-law had with her silent partners and lenders, small things that could matter when leverage was necessary, and I, of course, cooked. Every night I refined a braise here, a reduction there. I tuned sauces until they sang. I plated dishes in ways that made sense for an intimate table, not a gaudy dining room. I taught Omar to trust me in front of the staff, how to position little changes that seemed pedestrian, swap a garnish, rebalance a sauce, then watch how customers remembered the difference. There were risks. Omar could be recognized and suspected. Amir could spot a clause that made a plan impossible. Lila could fail to spin our narrative in a way that seemed genuine. But we all understood the calculus. The risk of staying silent was worse than the risk of moving. My husband, well, he remained a constant question mark. He liked my food, and he admired my confidence, but the idea of tangling with his mother was a pressure he was not willing to withstand. I'd woken him one morning with a plate and the news that I had been invited to run a 2-week consulting test helping modernize the menu. Nothing dramatic at a sister location of his mother's chain. His face went pale. "Don't," he said. "She'll see right through you." "Then let her see," I replied. "Let her see the kind of woman you married." There was resignation in his eyes, like someone watching a storm roll over a landscape they owned but refused to alter. He didn't stop me. He didn't warn his mother. He simply folded himself back into his comfortable silence. The consulting opportunity was a gift in every sense. It was public enough to be respectable, private enough to allow us a maneuvering room. I accepted under the guise of offering help, and the restaurant's management, proud, overconfident, and desperate for compliments, welcomed me. They called it a favor. I called it reconnaissance. Walking into the kitchen the first day under the restaurant's grand sign felt oddly like returning to an old battlefield. The staff eyed me with the thinly veiled suspicion that comes when new hands stamp where old ones reigned. The head chef was a brick of a man who believed in discipline above all. He checked his watch like a general. My mother-in-law, of course, didn't enter the kitchen. Her realm was the dining room, the chandeliers, the press clippings framed like trophies. But I had Omar at my side, and we moved like the tide. He pointed out which burners were miscalibrated, small inefficiencies that created uneven dishes. He showed me which prep lines had been shortened to save money, cost-saving measures that left the staff scrambling. I suggested, quietly and politely, changes that seemed like tweaks. Rotate fresh produce faster, reintroduce slow roasting for certain cuts, tweak seasoning profiles to make dishes warmer, more aromatic. The head chef brushed me off at first, but when a regular customer, someone who had been dining there for years, commented that a dish tasted better than it had in months, the head chef listened. A month of subtle improvements passed. I recommended suppliers who could deliver fresher stock at slightly higher cost, balancing the books by recommending a seasonal tasting menu that justified a modest price bump. I adjusted plating to remove the fussy elements that, in my opinion, distracted from flavor. People noticed. Reservations ticked up. Management breathed a sigh of relief. My plan was working. Be the quiet hand that fixed the leak, and thus be trusted. But trust is a double-edged knife. The more the staff and the managers relied on my suggestions, the closer they let me into the inner workings. We began to talk about restructuring, not because I demanded it, but because the numbers made sense. Amia, ever the cautious chess player, had already lined up options. A friendly investor who liked culinary stories, a small firm that specialized in buyouts when the owner was willing to sell a minority stake. We'd be patient, he said. Timing and optics, he kept repeating. We fix perception, then we fix the ledger. At home, I framed the story differently for my husband. I told him I was merely helping, nothing more. He nodded, relieved, and when I caught the flicker of something like shame or guilt in his eyes, I softened my voice and kissed his forehead. I didn't need him to be brave. I only needed him not to betray me. There were nights when doubt crept in. When a dinner went wrong or a critic's comment cut through our small bubble like a shard, I'd walk the quiet streets after late shifts, the city lights blinking like low embers, and wonder whether this was revenge or madness. But then I'd remember her voice in that first dining room, the sneer, the certainty. The memory of that moment kept me steady, a lodestone pulling me forward, and then, one evening as autumn pressed its first cool fingers into the air, everything we'd stitched together began to hum with possibility. The head manager called me into his office, his voice tight, but not unfriendly. He slid a set of printouts across the desk, declining cash reserves, upcoming leases, projections that looked like a patient about to cough. The numbers were worse than I'd thought. We could use help, he said, looking at me as if the very idea of help from someone like me was a lifeline. Help, I thought, yes. And in that small word, the chance I'd been waiting for, I left the office with the papers in my bag, my pulse steady. The plan had taken shape fully now, not a fantasy, not just a promise but a machine. All the pieces were in place. Lila's messaging, Omar's kitchen loyalty, Amia's financial scaffolding, my recipes and credibility. We'd built an elegant patient pressure, an engine that could politely pressure the owner into accepting help that would, at first glance, save her beloved restaurant. What she didn't realize was that the rescue would come wrapped in my hands, and like any good recipe that calls for a slow, careful reduction, everything was about to be turned down to a whisper, then brought to a boil at just the right moment. The papers in my bag felt heavier than their weight. Spreadsheets, forecasts, invoices, numbers, stacked like dominoes waiting for a push. I remember walking home that night, autumn wind tugging at my scarf, thinking, this is it. The moment I stop being a guest in their world and start becoming the architect of my own. But I couldn't act rashly. Revenge isn't a sprint, it's a simmer. If you turn the heat too high, the whole sauce burns. So I began carefully. Step 1. Control the narrative. With Lila's help, whispers began circulating in food circles. Not gossip exactly, just concerned voices about how the once great restaurant had lost its shine. Articles started to appear online, not scathing, but pitying. Words like nostalgic, in need of modern vision, once golden reputation, they cut sharper than insults. My mother-in-law adored prestige more than profit. And prestige was exactly what I chipped away first. At the same time, we launched soft praise for my food, not attached to my name yet, but attached to an up-and-coming culinary consultant revitalizing menus quietly behind the scenes. People in this industry crave discovery stories, and we fed them exactly that. Step 2. Control the kitchen. With Omar's guidance, the staff began to lean on me more. Little things, a sauce adjusted here, a plating suggestion there. The head chef stopped arguing when my changes drew compliments. Soon, when dishes went out, people would say, that was her idea, and I didn't have to correct them. Food is memory. And when guests started leaving with happier ones, I knew the tide had turned. Step 3. Control the ledger. Amir worked his quiet magic. He presented the manager with options, restructuring loans, pulling in investors, cutting losses with underperforming branches. But the twist was this: every path, every single one, eventually pointed back to me. I wasn't just a cook anymore. I was a solution. The breaking point came one evening when a well-known critic dined in. He'd been notorious for ripping apart restaurants that clung to outdated grandeur. He ordered the seasonal tasting menu. I designed a quiet showcase of my style. He left without saying much. But 2 days later, his review dropped. A restaurant clinging to its old name. Yes, but beneath the dust, a new voice is stirring. Elegant, confident, unpretentious. Whoever is responsible deserves the reins. It spread like wildfire. Reservations surged again, not for her legacy, but for this new mystery voice. And my mother-in-law. She basked in the attention at first, claiming credit, pretending it was her guidance. But praise can be dangerous when it belongs to someone else, because then came the investors. They wanted in. The revival looked promising, and the critics' words turned perception into currency. Amir arranged the meetings. My mother-in-law walked into them smug, assuming money would flow simply because of her family name. But investors are sharp-eyed predators. They wanted guarantees. They wanted the person behind the improvements. They wanted me. That meeting is burned into my memory. We sat in a sleek office downtown, leather chairs gleaming under recessed lighting. Across the table, a group of polished investors asked pointed questions. Who designed the new seasonal menu? Who suggested the supplier shift? Who is planning the brand reintroduction we've been hearing about? Her answers faltered. She tried to deflect. She tried to insist it was teamwork, leadership, tradition. But then, one investor turned to me directly. And you? He asked. What's your role? I smiled. Not shy, not arrogant, just steady. I'm the consultant they brought in. I've been helping modernize operations. Silence. A thick silence where everyone at the table realized exactly what was being unsaid. She's the one holding this place together. My mother-in-law's face burned crimson. I could feel her nails digging into the armrest of her chair. But she couldn't lash out. Not here, not in front of money. One of the investors leaned forward. If you were in charge, how would you expand this? That was the moment. The shift. The crown tilting. I laid it out not as revenge, not as ambition, but as vision. A cleaner brand. Seasonal rotations. Partnerships with local farms. A balance between heritage and modern palate. I spoke with the clarity of someone who didn't just want a restaurant, someone who wanted an empire. By the end of the meeting, the investors were nodding. By the end of the week, they made their decision. They would come in only if I had an official role in leadership. It was checkmate, because my mother-in-law adored prestige too much to turn down investors. She signed the agreements. She tied her restaurant's survival to my presence. She thought she was harnessing me when in reality, she had just handed me the keys. That night, alone in my kitchen at home, I cooked myself a simple meal. Nothing fancy, just pasta with a silky sauce, garlic browned in butter, fresh herbs chopped fine. I sat in silence, fork in hand, and thought, she told me I couldn't cook. But now, she can't even keep her restaurant alive without me. It wasn't the end. Not yet. Revenge rarely ends in a single move. But this was the moment I became more than a consultant. This was the night I became indispensable. And once someone like me becomes indispensable, the next step is inevitable. Ownership. Becoming indispensable wasn't the end. People who are indispensable are still tools, still under someone else's thumb. I didn't want to be useful. I wanted to be untouchable. Slowly, without announcement, I shifted from being a consultant into becoming the quiet power behind the restaurant. The menus were mine. The suppliers answered me first. The investors trusted me more than anyone else. The staff looked at me before they looked at her. It happened gradually, like vines covering an old wall, until one day, the wall was no longer visible. She didn't see it at first. Or maybe she did, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it. To acknowledge me would have been to admit she was wrong the night she mocked me across the dinner table. She could never do that. Behind the scenes, Amia and I worked to restructure debt and tie everything directly to my presence. On paper, it looked like investors were simply shoring up the restaurant. In truth, every loan, every capital injection, required my approval. She thought she was keeping her empire afloat. In reality, her empire floated only because I held it above water. Guests weren't coming for her name anymore. They came for the food. They came for the mystery chef. They came for the menus that carried soul, not show. I watched her face tighten every time someone praised a dish she didn't recognize. She would force a smile and say, "My daughter-in-law helps in the kitchen. She's learning. As if I was still fumbling, as if the praise wasn't mine. Tiho, my husband, urged me to stop. He said I'd proven my point. But he didn't understand. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about power. Every time his mother smiled in public, pretending I was still in her shadow, it stoked something deep inside me. She still believed I was beneath her, and that belief was a knife I was determined to turn back on her. The final push came at a gala. We catered the event, and I curated every dish with precision. Guests raved, critics praised, and the night was flawless until she stood at the microphone. Sequins glittering, chin lifted, she thanked the patrons and announced it was her vision, her leadership, that had kept the restaurant thriving. Then she added, with a sweet smile that was poison to me, "And of course, my daughter-in-law, who helps in the kitchen. She's learning, and we're proud of her progress." The humiliation burned hot, but I didn't flinch. I clapped politely. I smiled. And I decided, right then, that I wouldn't just run her restaurant in the shadows anymore. I would take it from her hands, entirely, publicly, permanently. When the financial reports came in weeks later, the timing was perfect. Despite the surge in popularity, the main location was losing money. She had been siphoning profits into vanity projects, lavish renovations, parties, galas that gained nothing. The investors were furious, and Amir had everything prepared. He presented the truth. Lila had a rebranding plan ready. Omar confirmed the staff's loyalty, and I walked into that boardroom beside her, knowing exactly how it would end. The investors didn't waste words. They told her plainly. The restaurant was failing under her management, and without me, they were pulling out. She turned on me, her eyes wide with rage. "You did this," she spat. "No," I said, calm as ever. "You did this. I just fixed what you broke." The papers were slid across the table. She hesitated, her hand trembling, but she signed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. If she refused, the empire would collapse. Her name was still on the sign outside. But the power, the real power, was mine now. That night, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I went home, made myself a quiet meal, and ate in silence. It wasn't victory yet. Not until the world knew it was me, not her. But I could feel the crown slipping from her head, inch by inch. And this time, I wasn't going to stop at being indispensable. This time, I would become the queen. The papers were signed. The power was mine, but power hidden in shadows is fragile. It can be denied, twisted, erased. To make it real, I had to step into the light. I had to let the world know the investors wanted a rebrand. The critics were hungry for the next big story. And I had been waiting for this moment from the night she told me I couldn't cook. We began quietly. The old menus were phased out, replaced by mine. The heavy, outdated dishes she clung to were retired, and in their place came food that told a story. Heritage dishes reimagined, flavors balanced with restraint and confidence. Every plate that left the kitchen now carried my voice. Then came the visuals. Lila worked with me on the branding. Clean lines, warm tones, nothing gaudy. A name that honored tradition but didn't bow to it. We didn't erase the past, we reframed it. We made the restaurant look less like a shrine and more like a living, breathing story still unfolding. When the signage went up, the city noticed. For the first time in decades, the restaurant had a new face. People whispered. Some were scandalized. Others were intrigued. Reservations doubled before we even finished the press release. And then came the launch night. The dining room glowed, filled with journalists, critics, influencers, longtime patrons, and new faces curious to see what had changed. My mother-in-law sat stiffly at a corner table, her smile stretched tight, her hands clenching the linen napkin in her lap. She thought she could still steal the spotlight by sheer presence, but the spotlight was no longer hers. Course after course went out, each one a statement. A reimagined lamb dish, braised low and slow, the sauce finished with a hint of citrus. A delicate seafood appetizer, plated with restraint, the flavors clean and confident. A dessert that blended her mother's old recipe with my own technique, honoring the past while surpassing it. The room buzzed. Phones flashed. Guests leaned across tables to murmur, "This is extraordinary." And then, when the main course cleared, the moment came. The lead critic, an older man whose words could crown or kill, stood and raised his glass. "This," he declared, "is not the restaurant I remember. This is something new, something alive. And whoever is responsible for this deserves to be recognized." Every eye turned toward me. Not her. Me. I rose slowly, calm but certain, and thanked him. My voice carried steady across the dining room. "I've been honored to work with the team here to bring new life to this place. Food isn't just recipes, it's memory, it's emotion, it's story. Tonight, I hope you tasted mine." Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. In that moment, I wasn't just a consultant, or a partner, or a shadow in the kitchen. I was the face of the restaurant. My mother-in-law's expression was something I'll never forget. Her smile never dropped, but her eyes betrayed everything. Fury, humiliation, defeat. She couldn't stand and take credit anymore, not without looking like a thief. The critics had crowned me. The investors backed me. The staff adored me. The room knew the truth, and once a truth like that enters the world, it can't be shoved back into silence. That night, the reviews poured in. Words like visionary, fearless, authentic. Not about her, about me. My name, printed in headlines she used to believe would always belong to her at home. I sat at the table, my hands trembling not with fear, but with the quiet weight of triumph. I thought of that night at her dining table, when she had sneered, "You can't cook," and I smiled, because the entire city now knew otherwise. But revenge is never just about one night, one headline, one victory. She still had her name on the building. She still had her claws in pieces of the empire. And I wasn't finished until it was all mine. The rebrand was only the opening move. The real game for public, irrevocable ownership was about to begin. The rebrand had worked. The city, the critics, the investors, they all saw me as the visionary. But her name was still on the door, and as long as it stayed there, she retained the illusion of control. Illusions, however, are fragile things. I knew the next step had to be decisive. I began with the staff. They already respected me, but loyalty alone wouldn't be enough. I needed them to understand that I was not just a figurehead, I was the heartbeat of this place. Subtle incentives, careful recognition, small authority shifts. The lead servers now reported to me on seating and service flow. The kitchen assistants followed my prep schedules. And the bartenders executed my curated drink pairings without question. In quiet ways, every operation of the restaurant ran under my guidance. Meanwhile, the investors were becoming restless with her interference. She would insist on unnecessary renovations, lavish parties, and extravagant marketing campaigns that threatened the budget. I let her push, knowing it would make the case for a full leadership transition undeniable. Each misstep she made strengthened my position. One evening, during a private investors' meeting, Amir presented a projection of cash flow that made the situation clear. If she maintained control, the restaurant could bleed out within a year. If I assumed full leadership, profitability and growth were guaranteed. She sat across the table, chin high, but I saw the hesitation in her eyes. Pride is a dangerous shield when the numbers scream otherwise. You need to make a choice, one investor said. Either full support under her current management, or we transfer operational control to her daughter-in-law. Her hand trembled slightly. That tiny flicker of doubt gave me all the leverage I needed. At home that night, I didn't boast or gloat. Instead, I prepared a quiet dinner for myself, slicing vegetables with precise calm, stirring sauces with patience, tasting each bite like it was the first and last I would ever create. I let the thought of her floundering in the empire she thought she still commanded simmer quietly in my mind. The next morning, I walked into the restaurant not as a consultant, not as a partner, but as the person in charge. Staff deferred to me naturally. Managers presented their reports to me first. Even the suppliers now confirmed deliveries with my name. I was, effectively, the ruler behind the curtain. Her attempts to interfere were subtle at first, a suggestion here, a complaint there. But I anticipated them, sidestepped them, reframed them. When she tried to take credit for a new menu rollout in a staff meeting, I smiled, acknowledged her presence, and reminded everyone gently but firmly, this menu reflects months of work by the team. With guidance on modernizing techniques and flavors, the staff nodded. She faltered. "B. Why the end of the month?" The investors formally transferred operational control to me. Her signature on the papers confirmed what everyone already knew. The restaurant thrived under my vision. Her empire, once untouchable, now operated entirely at my discretion. I didn't gloat when she confronted me later that evening. She had expected anger or fear. I gave neither. I simply said, calm and measured, "You taught me what not to do." I honored the good parts. I fixed the rest. Her face went pale. The words weren't just true, they were undeniable. She had created the conditions for her own downfall, and I had merely followed the path to its conclusion. In the weeks that followed, I continued refining operations, staff training, supplier relationships, menu innovation. All aspects of the restaurant now bore my imprint. Reservations surged. Press coverage praised a seamless blend of heritage and modern culinary artistry. The city, which once revered her, now sought me out as the new standard of excellence. And through it all, I maintained control without cruelty. I never fired her outright. I allowed her small appearances in the dining room, keeping up the illusion she so desperately clung to. After all, true power doesn't need to humiliate. It simply shifts the balance until no one can resist. I had taken her restaurant, her reputation, and her crown, but done so with finesse. Every plate, every decision, every subtle maneuver reminded me that revenge doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be effective. That night, standing alone in the kitchen after the last customer had left, I looked around at the polished counters, the gleaming pans, the aromas still lingering in the air. I had done it. I had turned her arrogance against her, transformed the doubt into opportunity, and claimed my place. I whispered quietly to the empty room, "You said I couldn't cook. Now, I own it all." And for the first time in years, I felt not just vindicated, but unstoppable. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place quietly. Not with confrontation, not with shouting, not with vengeance performed in the open, but with subtlety, patience, and precision. By now, the restaurant was mine in every sense that mattered. Every decision, every dish, every penny, every vision, it all passed through me. She had her name on the door, yes, but the crown, the throne, the pulse of the empire, it all belonged to me. There was a strange kind of serenity in that realization. For years, I had been dismissed, underestimated, told I wasn't capable. And now, the city's most critical eyes were on me, praising my work. Investors trusted me implicitly. Staff looked to me not just for guidance, but for inspiration. And my husband, he no longer doubted me. He watched me from the kitchen doorway one evening, leaning against the frame, silent but awed. I caught his gaze and smiled. He nodded, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between us. This was my triumph, my fight, my empire. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, nights of exhaustion, the constant balancing act of keeping the legacy alive while reshaping it. But those challenges were part of the thrill, part of the journey. Every plate I served, every menu I crafted, every critic's nod was proof that persistence, skill, and patience outshine cruelty and arrogance. Every time my mother-in-law tried, occasionally, to insert herself, but by now it was futile. She had been reduced to a figurehead, her pride bruised but intact enough to maintain appearances. I let her keep the illusion. There was no need to crush her further. True power doesn't scream, it commands quietly, invisibly, in the way the world bends to it. The grand reopening under my brand was a night I will never forget. Lights twinkled across the dining room, journalists snapped photos, and patrons buzzed with excitement. Every seat was filled. Every dish flew from the kitchen with precision and flair. And when I stepped onto the small stage to thank everyone, the applause wasn't just polite, it was genuine. And deserved. I looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who now trusted me implicitly. And I felt the weight of every insult, every doubt, every dismissive word my mother-in-law had thrown at me. And I felt triumphant not with malice, but with clarity. I had turned her arrogance into opportunity. I had transformed her skepticism into fuel. And I had built something far greater than anyone had imagined. Late that night, when the lights were dimmed and the last customer had left, I walked through the kitchen alone. I ran my hands over the polished counters, the gleaming equipment, the organized chaos of creativity at its peak. I paused, breathing in the aroma of herbs, spices, and simmering sauces. I whispered to myself softly, "You told me I couldn't cook. You told me I'd never led. You told me I was nothing." And then I smiled, letting the truth sink in. I had done more than cook. I had conquered. I had led. I had claimed everything she thought she could keep from me. And now, the empire was mine. I had won. Not with bitterness, not with hatred, but with patience, skill, courage, and vision. I had taken the crown she assumed she'd always wear and shaped it into my own legacy. And as I locked the kitchen door and walked home that night, the city lights flickering around me like a constellation of opportunities, I knew something simple, undeniable, and true. Revenge is sweetest when it's quiet, calculated, and complete, and mine was absolute. All right, everyone, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. If you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe. Have a great day or night, and I'll see you next time.